Michael Lorimer, we're talking about superannuation, and in the first segment we discussed superannuation was set up to help us prepare for retirement, be independent of the government, which is good for us and it's good for the taxpayers when we're no longer working because they won't have to look after us. And that's good for me when I'm the taxpayer and somebody else. I want them to be independent, have as much money as they want, I don't care. Just don't be a burden on the public purse then. And in the second segment and third, we've talked about how the rules have started changing so that there's less people participating in that. Now, you used the word regressive to describe the budget measures regarding superannuation introduced by Treasurer Morrison last year. And we heard that there's now this anti-conservative philosophy creeping into the so-called major conservative party in Australia, where it's almost like a competition with the Labor Party to see who can hit rich people the most. And by doing so, they're destabilising the whole perception of the security and the risk of superannuation. Now, in the recent budget, we heard the idea mentioned and discussed extensively in media that perhaps first home buyers should be able to take money or borrow money from their superannuation to be able to help them buy their first home too. Apparently we've got this huge problem of housing affordability. Barnaby Joyce says, yes, if you want a view of the Sydney Harbour Bridge, we have a housing affordability problem, but the rest of Australia, there are affordable houses. What's the real issue there, and is superannuation part of the solution?
Okay, Dave. There was a lot of noise in the media about proposals to allow young people, I think those between 35 and 48 or something like that, to be able to access their superannuation balance for a deposit on a first home. That measure was not ultimately proceeded with in the budget, but a so-called housing affordability and superannuation package was announced in this year's budget a couple of weeks ago. But as opposed to allowing a person to actually draw down on existing savings, the proposal is to allow people to put in extra contributions from their pre-tax earnings into a special superannuation account that in a period of time is able to be accessed, unlike other contributions that have to stay in the system for retirement purposes. So that's compared to just a unilateral ability for anybody to just access an existing account, a superannuation account for home buying. That current proposal is a much more palatable one because you're not actually raiding your existing savings. It's actually additional tax-preferred savings. But the problem, I still think, with that proposal is that housing affordability or housing per se has got nothing to do with the long-term objectives and purpose of our superannuation system. Our superannuation system is there to encourage people to save ultimately for their retirement.
Doesn't owning your own home debt-free by the time you retire perfectly complement the goals of financial independence when you retire?
I'd accept that argument, but I don't believe that achieving that goal should come at the cost of ultimately dipping into your retirement savings pool. And why the government and this is not the first time we've seen a housing type of package associated with superannuation. We've seen 2 or 3 versions of it over many years, and they've all been abandoned.
Is it, the way I understand it, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong and clear it up, is that they're basically saying use a superannuation fund like a bank account so it can grow a bit more aggressively than perhaps your traditional saving for your deposit would. Is that the way it's working?
Spot on. That's what's proposed to work.
How does that hurt savings for retirement?
Well, you'd much rather see those additional contributions being added to your ultimate nest egg so that you've got a bigger financial resource when you retire to pay your retirement income. And so achieve entering the housing market in other ways. I've seen some modelling on that proposal as well, and the actual tax advantages around the proposal are relatively immaterial.
Really?
So if you were just saving your money in a bank account, for example, and having the interest tax at your marginal rate versus this proposed package, you're not talking about sheep stations. You're talking about, $10,000 type of scenarios for an average person saving for a home. So it's not, if you're able to save as a couple $50,000 for a deposit on a home just through a normal bank account, this scheme is not going to allow you to save 100. It's nothing like it. It might allow you to get 60. Something like that. And then of course entering the housing market, you've got all the other entry costs, state stamp duties and all the rest of it. The whole transaction costs of entering the housing market.
Let's talk about the economic basics of the viability of this strategy to achieve the stated outcome, which is housing affordability. If you give people more money to spend, and certainly $60,000 deposit helps you buy and get a better loan for a bigger house than a $50,000 deposit would, if you give people the ability to spend more, does that help prices come down?
Well, no, not one. I'm no economist, but from the economics that I have studied, no, that makes no sense to me at all. On the contrary, you would argue that it actually would had an impact on increasing prices. So I think overall, whether we have a housing affordability crisis or not, I'll take your point about Barnaby Joyce's position. Depending on where you are and the choices you make, you might view it as a housing affordability crisis.
It may be that our eyes are bigger than our stomach.
Correct. But ultimately, it's all about choices, and overall, it comes down to a supply issue. And from a basic economic premise, if you've got increased supply, then that should drive prices down. So whether that's what role the government plays in that in terms of releasing land for development, etc. That's really what it's. If you're looking at Australia as a whole, that's what it comes down to.
That's a policy I've heard some minor parties float before, is that housing affordability is an easy problem to solve by the increased release of land, because when you've got more money to spend, then you've got more competition amongst buyers, which drives prices up. But when you've got more land to sell, that increases competition amongst builders and sellers. And so the consumers have more choice, and that drives prices down because people want to attract the buyer.
Absolutely. That's how I see it.
It's kind of basic.
It is.
How does the government not see this? Or is it not in their interest to see it?
Yeah, exactly. I'm sure they do see it. And that's why the Treasurer Morrison announced on budget night this year that some defence-owned land would be released, which conveniently is in the seat held by Bill Shorten. So there's a lot of political mileage made out of that.
So real estate prices will go down in Bill Shorten's electorate,
Maribyrnong,
which will be bad for Bill Shorten, but good for first home buyers in his electorate.
Correct.
So I guess it just depends where they think the most votes are, in existing real estate owners or wannabe real estate owners.
Yeah, but look, in principle though, I just think it's not. The housing piece is just not something that should be intermingled with our superannuation system. Let's get some certainty and stability into that system. Let's get some clarity around what it is all about. What's its role? If its role is to encourage people to save through a compulsory and voluntary framework, assets in a long-term accumulation vehicle, which ultimately puts them in a better financial position to be either not reliant or at least less reliant on the public purse.
Yes.
If we accept that that's the objective and purpose of superannuation, then leave it alone.
That's right.
Let's run with that, and it's not and it shouldn't be a political football.
No.
This should be a bipartisan a bipartisan approach. It's too important to be politicised.
Yeah, that's right.
And
no, it's a good place to, I guess, wrap this interview up is a call for stability. And the way voters can support the stability that we need is to signal to our candidates who are seeking election or re-election, leave superannuation alone. Stop pursuing socialist, green-eyed policies where we want to take rich people's money away from them and introduce stability in the superannuation industry and the regulations around it, which will benefit everybody.
everyone, yes, totally agree.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your insights and making some really complicated and scary policy areas simple and accessible for us today.
My pleasure.
Appreciate your time.
Cheers.
Thanks for watching. If you really enjoyed that video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. Have a look at this great video next and check out the website for even more interesting articles and episodes later.